Young people marching. A new generation speaking truth to power. This one out of Africa. But these young people march with extraordinary courage because they are confronting corrupt power. Will many young people join them in their multi-trillion-dollar global mission? Welcome to Business and Society. I'm John Palusek, host of the program. Yes, trillions of dollars. That's what U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry says corruption costs the global economy annually. Imagine, he has said, the difference that would make to all those kids yearning for jobs and opportunity, for electricity, for education. Yes, imagine. And so in this edition, we will imagine fighting global corruption, the multi-trillion-dollar mission. Some might scoff at an effort to confront so vast a global issue, but a growing number of international nonprofit organizations are doing just that. And now, importantly, a new generation of young people is volunteering for this mission. I am very pleased to welcome to the program Professor Carolyn Predmore, Director of Global Business Studies in the Manhattan College's School of Business, and a distinguished academic author, researcher, and teacher of the subjects we're about to address. Welcome, Professor Predmore. Carolyn.
Good morning, John.
This brief caveat about our objective. First, let's recognize and encourage the great efforts of the people and organizations now confronting corruption, especially as it occurs at the business-government interface. And then, because the anti-corruption fight will be a long one, we especially want to alert and motivate younger audiences, college students, and others, some like those in our opening sequence, members of the International Youth Network Against Corruption. After all, they will inherit the earth. Carolyn, let's start with acknowledging the fact that there is increasing interest by students, young people, in some of the countries around the world that have suffered especially from corruption.
There is, and it's been published just recently in the month of November about students in Nigeria and Pakistan that have started to take real stands on trying to fight corruption in their countries. They see the corruption and bribery on a daily basis. What needs to be brought forward is what are the possible ways you can combat corruption, and that's really important.
And how do we bring that home? How do we get students in the United States, at Manhattan College, aware and involved in the corruption issue?
Part of how we look at it is we have a class that actually looks at international business practices, and we take students from Manhattan College to different countries in succeeding years. So we've been to India. India is one of those countries where they say it's transactional corruption. That with every transaction, whether it needs to be should be a free transaction or whether there's one for which there's a fee, there's another fee underneath of it that is the bribe. And so it happens with every interaction that you have. And our students experience that.
And you're going to continue to do that?
We continue, yes, every year. So this year we're going to Peru, where there is an issue with illegal gold mining in the jungles of Madre de Dios. And the undergraduates are going to be looking in the semester in advance of the trip about illegal gold mining. What are the unintended consequences? Who's benefiting, cui bono? Because that's important to consider when you try to think of alternatives for that location.
And right now, or coming forward from even this date, American students ought to be looking very carefully at the news on things like the new administration and its take on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act?
Well, we've got a very interesting situation. We have someone who's been a successful business person. He has been an international, global business person. And so I think this is going to be a great learning lab that we have in terms of how do we allow people from all walks of life to participate in government, which is what we want, and yet follow best government practices, best honesty practices, best business practices.
And we have to be alert to any changes in emphasis in, say, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the Security and Exchange Commission's work in this area.
That's absolutely true. I mean, we at the state level as well as the federal level must be aware of what's happening with our elected officials so that what happens in Congress is stuff that we want to be happening in Congress, and that we keep the safeguards and strengthen them where we see that they need to be.
And our business people abroad have to be very much aware of and in concert with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Absolutely. And interestingly enough, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act deals with public officials. It's still apparently quite legal to bribe private ownership. So what we're talking about with the Corrupt Practices Act is bribing of public officials. Anywhere a U.S. company goes, they still are under the control of U.S. law. And companies that do business here in the United States are under the aegis of U.S. law. And they need to be aware of that.
And all of this is within the framework here at Manhattan in terms of the way you teach business practices from a framework of corporate social responsibility and sustainable development.
Well, we're LaSallian. So John Baptiste de LaSalle, as one of his foundational points, has said that we need to have a practical education. And it's very practical to educate our students in what happens in business, what are you likely to be faced with, and arm them with possible ways of getting out of that situation. What are the best business practices? Where does that honestly lead you? I'm doing a study with one of our other professors, and one of the things that we've written in the chapter is that honesty really does lead to greater profitability in the long term for a business rather than that short-term gain.
And so you probably point out to your students some of the organizations that are doing some great work in anti-corruption.
I highlight them in my class. I mean, there is Transparency International, and certainly one of the great tools in fighting corruption is shining a light on practices that are corrupt and should be eliminated. There's the UN Global Compact. I mean, I highlight that in class too. So we have some really well-informed and well-known companies and organizations that get very much involved in this, and it's critical.
And speaking about the UN Global Compact, obviously it has as one of its principles an anti-corruption principle.
Yes, it does.
And it also has an association with an organization which is UN-sponsored, the Principles of Responsible Management Education, several hundred schools around the world, which could be a powerful instrument for getting these messages across to students.
It's very important. I think we see regularly some business person that has managed to abrogate every concept of what is honest and real and important for business to hold those standards. And people then come back at business schools and say, well, what have you been teaching? And the answer is, well, we need to show that we've been teaching good ethical practices and revisit those good ethical practices on a semester-by-semester basis.
Well, you know, speaking of the UN, there was a wonderful statement on this subject by a UN leader, Yuri Fedotov, and I think it's worth reflecting on. This is what he said. He said, corruption and bribery devastates lives. No country is immune. Everyone suffers. The malicious impact of corruption makes people's lives more expensive. It erodes consumer confidence and business credibility. It depletes public funds and destroys prospects for a fair society. Very strong statement.
And absolutely true. When someone does not carry their fair share, they're not stealing from the government. They're stealing from their community. It means that there is not money for roads and bridges. There's not money for public transportation. If you look at the countries that tend to have problems with their economies, they're the ones that tend to make a game of not following the rules. I've had a couple of students write papers on these issues, and I have to say it is secondary research, but when you look at, say, Germany and how they're very concerned with how should it be done, this is the way it needs to be done. Their economy is the bulwark of the European Union. And then you look at some of the economies where there may be a little bit of a game of how to get away with paying less than your fair share. Those economies tend to be the ones that don't have the extra in the budget to carry them over the rough spots.
Professor Predmore, Carolyn,
Yes.
thank you so much for coming and bringing those very valuable insights to the program.
I was happy I could participate. Thank you for asking me.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of Business in Society. We'll close now with a poignant call for action from the International Youth Network Against Corruption.
Youth should be involved individually and actively in the fight against corruption, pledging not to engage in corruption and ensuring they participate in championing for a corrupt-free world and speaking against corruption.